He accidentally enhanced her, coconuts. Now she's totally embarrassed. Nick Rahia squinted against the violet sunlight, filtering through the dense canopy overhead, even after 2 weeks on. Vera Prime, the perpetual twilight of the planet, still threw off his internal clock. He checked his wrist display 0730. Local time, and quickened his pace along the crystalline path, toward the Science Academy late on your 3rd day stellar. Impression, rays, he muttered to himself, the towering spires of the academy. Gleamed in the distance, absorbing the purple light, and refracting it in mesmerizing patterns normally Nick would have stopped to appreciate the view, but today Lieutenant Commander Voss Harrell would be assigning him his permanent post, and Varians valued punctuality above almost everything, except their ridiculous social hierarchy. As he approached the academy gates, 2 Varian guards snapped to attention. Their violet skin seemed to shimmer beneath their silver armor, and their green vertical pupils narrowed as they assessed him. Identification, the taller one demanded. Her voice melodic despite its coldness. Nick slapped his palm against the scanner with unnecessary force. Nick Ray's Earth Exchange Program Cybernetics Division. The scanner flashed green, but the guards didn't soften their stance. You are precisely 8 minutes and 43 seconds late, Technician Ray's the second guard said. Lieutenant Commander V. Harrell has noted your tardiness. Of course he has. Nick sighed. Don't suppose you guys have coffee around here that's on? Hangover's killing me. The guard stared at him blankly. Right, no humor, got it. Nick flashed them a salute that would have gotten him written up in any Earth military outfit, and strode through the gates. Inside the academy bustled with Varian scientists and administrators, all moving with deliberate purpose. Their silver hair was uniformly styled in elaborate braids that signified rank and discipline, a stark contrast to Nick's rumpled dark curls that he'd barely run a hand through that morning. He navigated the labyrinthine corridors by memory, finally reaching Boss Harl's office precisely 11 minutes late. Taking a deep breath, he knocked enter. Came the clip response. Lieutenant Commander Viscero stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. Like all Varians, he towered over Nick by at least a foot. His ceremonial robe shimmered with embedded status indicators, thousands of tiny lights that brought broadcast his accomplishments in lineage to anyone who knew how to read them. Technician Ray's Vural didn't turn from the window. Your punctuality leaves much to be desired. Sorry, sir, still adjusting to the planetary cycle. You've had 16 days. That excuse expired approximately 15 days ago. Voss Harrell finally turned his green eyes, narrowing. However, your technical credentials are exceptional, which is why, despite my reservations, I've assigned you to our most prestigious research division. Nick straightened his interest peak despite himself. What division would that be, sir? Xenobiological integration. You'll be working directly with Lady Leah Zeva on cross-species cellular regeneration. Nick's eyebrows shot up. Zeva is in the High Council. Zev Thea, the very same Lady Leah, is 3rd in succession to the family seat, and the Academy's foremost xenobiologist. V. Harrell's mouth tightened into what might have been a smile on a human. Try not to embarrass our species. No pressure. Then Nick muttered. V. Harrell tapped his wrist display. Lady Leah will meet you in laboratory 7 in 20 minutes. Do not be late. In Technician Ray's do dot. He paused, green eyes boring into Nick's. The Lady Zev Thea is not accustomed to Earth's casual demeanor. I suggest you adjust accordingly. Crystal clear, sir. Dismissed. Nick managed to keep his sarcastic salute internal this time. As he left the office, a high-ranking aristocrat, just what he needed more. Varian stiffness and protocol. He'd signed up for this exchange to work with cutting-edge tech, not to navigate alien Politics he found laboratory 7 easily enough. It was 3 times the size of the others with actual windows. Overlooking the academy gardens, Nick paused at the entrance, straightening his uniform and running a hand through his hair in a futile attempt to tame it. The door slid open before he could knock. Inside, the lab gleamed with equipment that would make Earth's best facilities look like children's toys holographic. Displays flickered with complex molecular structures, and the air hummed with the sound of advanced computing systems, but it wasn't the technology that stopped Nick in his tracks. Lady Leah Zara stood at the central console, her back to the door, even from behind. She commanded presence, tall even for a Varian, with silver hair cascading down her back in intricate braids that spoke of her high status. When she turned, Nick struggled to maintain his professional demeanor. Her features were striking: high cheekbones, full lips, and almond-shaped eyes with vertical pupils of the most intense green he'd ever seen, almost golden in the lab's light. Her violet skin seemed to glow from within, and the formal scientific attire she wore did little to hide her graceful figure. Technician Rays, she said, her voice cool and melodic. You're early. How unexpected, given your record thus far. Nick blinked, thrown off balance. Please spare me. The Earth pleasantries Commander Voss Harrell informed me of your unconventional approach. She gestured to a workstation. You'll be stationed there. Your access is limited to non-critical systems until you prove yourself trustworthy. Nick's momentary awe hardened into irritation. With all due respect, Lady Zev Thea, I was top of my class at MIT Luna and have 3 patents in regenerative cybernetics. I didn't come all the way to Vera Prime to be treated like an intern. Leah raised a single silver eyebrow, the only indication that his words had any impact. Impressive credentials for a human, certainly. However, on Vera Prime, trust is earned, not assumed. Because of academic achievements, she turned back to her console. Today, you will familiarize yourself with our systems and review the project parameters. And what exactly is this project? Voss Harrell mentioned cross-species cellular regeneration, but was light on details. Leah tapped her console, and a holographic display materialized between them, a complex molecular structure rotating slowly in the air. We are developing methods to regenerate tissue across different species, she explained. Currently, most medical technology is species-specific. A skin regenerator designed for Varians would be useless, possibly harmful for humans. We seek to change that. Despite his annoyance, Nick was intrigued. Universal regeneration tech, that's actually pretty revolutionary indeed. Was that a hint of pride in her voice? The applications would be extensive, particularly in frontier colonies with mixed species populations. Nick studied the molecular structure. This is a hormone-based approach, correct? We're focusing on triggering natural regeneration processes rather than synthetic replacements. Nick moved closer to the display, forgetting his irritation as his scientific curiosity took over. Smart, less rejection issues, but you'd need a evil cellular receptor that doesn't currently exist in any known species. Leah's eyes widened slightly. The Varian equivalent of shock. That's precisely our current obstacle. Mind if I take a look at your current formula? For a moment, Leah seemed to hesitate, then nodded. Your perspective may be valuable. Over the next few hours, Nick lost himself in the work. Despite her cold demeanor, Leah was brilliant, and their scientific discussion flowed more easily than he'd expected. By mid-afternoon, he'd identified several potential modifications to their approach. If we adjust the molecular binding here, he said, manipulating the holographic structure, we could create a receiver that mimics aspects of both human and Varian cellular structures. Elria leaned Closer, her silver hair brushing against his shoulder. As she studied his modifications, Nick caught a subtle scent. Something like cinnamon and ozone, and found himself momentarily distracted. Interesting approach, she admitted. Unorthodox, but potentially viable. That's me, unorthodox, but viable, Nick quipped. With a grin, the corner of Leah's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Enough that Nick counted it as a victory. You may begin synthesizing a prototype. Tomorrow, she said, stepping back. For now, it's late. The first meal rotation has already begun in the communal hall. Nick glanced at his display. They'd work straight through lunch. Thanks, but I think I'll pass on the Varian cuisine. Tonight, last time I tried it, my tongue went numb for 3 hours this time. Leah's lips definitely quirked upward. You were served traditional car. It's considered impolite not to finish it despite the neurotoxins. Neurotoxins? You people eat neurotoxins for fun, in carefully regulated amounts. They produce pleasant sensations for Ian. I forgot humans lack the necessary enzymes to process them properly. Nick stared at her. Was that a joke, ladies of Thea? Her expression immediately returned to its neutral state. Simply an observation. Good evening, technician. Raise. Over the next 2 weeks, a routine developed. Nick would arrive at the lab each morning increasingly on time, and they would work together on the regeneration formula, despite their different approaches, Nick preferring intuitive leaps while Leah methodically worked through each possibility. They made surprising progress. Nick also made it his personal mission to crack through Leah's icy exterior. He'd drop casual jokes, share stories about Earth, and occasionally ask questions about Varian culture. At first, she responded with minimal courtesy, but gradually, her responses grew longer and sometimes he caught a flash of genuine interest in those striking eyes. So let me get this straight, Nick said one afternoon as they worked side by side. You've never had ice cream, not once in your life. Varians do not typically consume frozen dairy products, Elria replied, not looking up from her console. That's criminal. Seriously, I'm going to have to file a complaint with the High Council. Nick shook his head in mock dismay. What about movies? Please tell me you've at least watched a movie. Elria paused her work. We have cultural narratives. Yes, not the same thing. Movie night, it's happening. I smuggled in some classics from Earth. That would be inappropriate, Lara said, but Nick caught the slight dilation of her pupil's interest, despite her denial. Science demands exploration, ladies of Thea. Consider it cultural research. By the 3rd week, their prototype elixir was taking shape. Nick had developed a formula that theoretically could stimulate targeted tissue growth in both human and Varian physiology, though it remained untested. The simulation results are promising, Elle acknowledged, reviewing the data, though I notice the effects are significantly stronger on mammalian tissues. Makes sense, it's using modified human growth hormones as a base. Nick explained, we can adjust the ratios if needed. When will it be ready for preliminary testing? I should have a stable sample by tomorrow. The next day, Nick arrived at the lab with the completed prototype, a small vial of iridescent blue liquid. He placed it in a secured container labeled prototype GH7, human use only, in both English and Varian script. Finally finished it, Leah asked, approaching his workstation. Yep, next step would be controlled testing. But we need approval from the ethics committee. First, before Lara could respond, V. Harold's voice came over the intercom. Lady Zara, technician, raise your Prasid is required at tonight's diplomatic reception. The Terran ambassador wishes to review your progress. Nick groaned, great politics. It's a necessary part of securing continued funding. Leah reminded him. The reception begins in 2 hours. I suggest you find more appropriate attire. What's wrong with my uniform? Leah's eyes traveled over him in a way that made Nick suddenly self-conscious it lacks. Formality, the diplomatic reception was held in the Academy's Grand Hall, a soaring space with crystal chandeliers that refracted the light into patterns mimicking Vera's constellations. Nick had managed to locate a formal tan diplomatic uniform slightly too tight across the shoulders. But better than nothing, he spotted Elria immediately. She stood among a group of Varian officials wearing formal attire that accentuated her tall, graceful form. Far more than her lab clothes ever had the silver-blue fabric shimmered with embedded status lights, and her hair was arranged in an even more elaborate series of braids that framed her face perfectly. Nick grabbed a drink from a passing server and made his way toward her. As he approached, he noticed how the other Varans deferred to her there. Posture stiffening in respect. Lady Thea, he greeted with a slight bow. Remembering his cultural training, you look different outside the lab. Leah turned, and for a moment Nick thought he saw a flash of relief in her eyes. Technician, raise your attire is adequate. High praise indeed, he laughed. How long do we have to stay at this thing? Until the ambassador has been properly respected, she replied, then lowered her voice. Approximately 2 hours if precedent holds well, at least there's drinks. Nick raised his glass only to pause when he noticed a similar vial in Laria's hand. The contents looked oddly familiar, iridescent blue, just like his eyes. Widened in horror, Leah wait, but she had already raised the vial to her lips and consumed the contents in one elegant swallow. Nick froze, his mind racing. That couldn't be his prototype. He'd left it secured in the lab, properly labeled. Is something wrong? Leah asked, nodding his expression. That drink, what was it? The traditional ceremonial beverage. All participants must consume it to signal good faith in negotiations. She tilted her head. Why do you ask? Nick forced a smile. No reason, just curious about Varian customs. He spent the next hour in anxious observation, watching Elria for any signs of distress or reaction, but she continued her diplomatic duties, flawlessly showing no indication that anything was amiss by the time he escorted her back to the laboratory to retrieve her personal items. Nick had almost convinced himself that it wasn't his elixirs she had consumed. Our progress impressed the ambassador, Leah noted, as they entered the lab. Full funding for the next research cycle is virtually assured. Great news, Nick replied distractedly, making a beeline for his workstation. The secured container was exactly where he left it, but empty. His stomach dropped. Elria, did you move my prototype number? Why would I? She stopped mid-sentence, sudden understanding crossing her features. The ceremonial beverage, yeah, I think you might have just consumed an experimental human growth hormone elixir. Leah's normally composed face showed genuine alarm. That's impossible. The servers would never. Someone must have mixed them up. Maybe thought it was meant for the ceremony. Nick ran a hand through his hair. But look, it's designed for human physiology. Your Varan biology should neutralize most of the effects. Leah nodded slowly, visibly regaining her composure. Yes, Varian cellular structures are fundamentally different from human ones. The probability of cross-species reactivity is minimal. Exactly, and even if there is some reaction, the formula is designed to stimulate natural healing and growth processes, not create new ones. Then logically, there is no cause for concern. Elria straightened her shoulders. We will monitor the situation, but I see no reason for alarm. Nick wasn't entirely convinced, but her logical approach calmed his anxiety. Right, and first thing tomorrow we'll run some tests to make sure everything's normal. Agreed. Good night, technician. Raise night, Leah, and call me if you notice anything unusual. Okay, she nodded, and departed with her usual grace, leaving Nick staring Anxiously at the empty container, the next morning Nick arrived at the lab early, determined to develop some kind of counter-agent just in case. He was deep in molecular modeling when the lab door slid open with unusual force. Elria stood in the doorway, but not with her usual composed posture. Her breath came in short gasps, her normally perfect hair slightly disheveled, and her formal attire appeared hastily assembled. Most shocking of all was her expression, wide-eyed and flustered in a way he'd never seen on any Varian Leah. What's wrong? She closed the door behind her and leaned against it. Your elixir, she whispered, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. It had an effect. Nick approached cautiously. What kind of effect? Leah's violet skin darkened across her cheeks. Aryan blush. My anatomical proportions have altered overnight. Altered how? Nick asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. Instead of answering, Elria gestured to her chest area, which Nick now noted seemed significantly more prominent than before. The formal attire she typically wore with ease now strained noticeably across her upper body. Oh, was all he could manage. This is unprecedented, Elria said, her voice rising slightly. Varian females do not possess such excessive mammary development. It's inappropriate, unseemly. And she stopped abruptly, wincing as she shifted position, and what Nick prompted. And they are extremely sensitive, she admitted, her flush deepening to a rich purple. Every movement causes sensations. Nick tried and failed to keep his eyes at face level. I'm sorry, I never thought you must fix this immediately, Elria interrupted, before anyone discovers what has happened. I'll try, but I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with, Nick said, slipping into professional mode. Despite the bizarre situation, we should run some tests. Leah's eyes widened with genuine alarm. No tests, no records, no one can know about this, especially not. The lab door slid open, revealing an elderly Varian male in formal council robes. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene before him, Leah's disheveled appearance and Nick standing unusually close to her uncle Thaler. Leah gasped, immediately straightening and clasping her hands formally before her, emotion that obviously caused her discomfort. Given her new sensitivity, Lady Thea, the elder acknowledged coldly, before turning his severe gaze to Nick, and this must be the human technician I've heard so much about. Nick Ray is Sir. Nick offered his hand before remembering that Varians, especially high-ranking ones, rarely engaged in physical contact with outsiders. Thor ignored the gesture. I came to personally review your research progress, niece. The High Council is most interested in your collaboration, of course, Uncle. Elria said, her professional mask slipping back into place despite her physical discomfort, though we were just about to. What has happened to your appearance? Thor interrupted, his gaze fixed on Leah's noticeably altered silhouette. Elria froze, her composure cracking. There was an accident, Nick interjected with one of our experiment. Al formulas. Thor's eyes widened, then narrowed dangerously. You experimented on a member of the High Council lineage. No, it was my fault, Leah said quickly. I accidentally consumed silence. Thaler commanded, do you realize what this means? Under Varian law, human section 42 of the ancient code is explicit. Any outsider who physically alters a noble woman's body becomes permanently responsible for her. Nick blinked. Wait, what? Responsible? How, uncle? That law is archaic and hasn't been invoked in generations. Elria protested, a note of panic in her voice. It has never been removed from the code, Thaler countered. And in this case, its application seems most appropriate. His thin lips curved in what might have been satisfaction. Congratulations, technician. Rays, according to our most sacred laws, you are now culturally bound to Lady Leazara as her protector and partner. Partner, Nick echoed. You mean like in your Earth terminology? I believe fiance would be the closest approximation Tor said coldly. The High Council will be. Most interested to hear of this development, he turned and left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving Nick and Lara staring at each other in stunned silence. Did he just say we're engaged? Nick finally managed. Leah sank into a chair, wincing as her new sen's ID made itself known again. This is a diplomatic disaster, she whispered. My family, the council, the entire research program, hang on, Nick said, trying to process. There must be some way around this. We just need to reverse the effects of the elixir, and if we cannot, Elria looked up at him, her green eyes showing vulnerability he'd never seen before. What then? Technician Ray's. Nick ran a hand through his hair, the full implications of their situation sinking in. Then, I guess we're going to find out just how good I am at being a Varian fiance. As if on cue, Leah's communicator chimed with multiple incoming messages. The news was already spreading through the academy. She looked down at her altered body, then back at Nick, a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and something else flickering across her features. I believe the humans have an expression for situations like this, she said with uncharacteristic dryness. Yeah, Nick agreed. We are completely, utterly screwed. Nick leaned against the lab counter, watching as Lara paced back and forth, her communicator continuing to chime with incoming messages. Each time she moved, he couldn't help but notice how her newly enhanced assets shifted beneath her formal attire. He quickly averted his eyes, but not quickly enough. Damn, those Varian robes are really working overtime now, he thought, a mixture of guilt and undeniable masculine appreciation coursing through him. Stop looking at them, Elria snapped, crossing her arms defensively over her chest, then immediately wincing at the contact. I wasn't. Nick started, then shrugged with a half grin. Okay, maybe I was. Sue me, I'm only human. This is not amusing. Technician Ray's. Leah's cheeks flushed that fascinating shade of deep purple. Again, the High Council will convene an emergency session by this evening. Nick pushed himself away from the counter and approached her. Look, we need to tackle this systematically first. Let's work on an antidote second. We find a way around this ridiculous ancient law, and third, we figure out how to deal with your uncle, who clearly has it out for both of us. Leah's eyes narrowed. Thor is second chair of the High Council. His influence is considerable. Yeah, I got that impression from his warm and fuzzy personality. Nick ran a hand through his hair. What's his problem with humans anyway? He led the opposition to the human Varian exchange program from the beginning, Leah explained. He believes Vera should maintain its isolation and cultural purity. Great, so I just accidentally handed him the perfect excuse to shut down the entire program. Nick grabbed a data pad and started scanning through molecular formulas. No pressure. Leah's communicator chimed again, and she checked the message with visible dread. It's worse than that. The council has appointed a cultural aide to monitor us. Zor, another one of your cheery relatives. Zor is. Elria hesitated. He served as my childhood instructor in the family disciplines. He is rigidly traditional, even by Varian standards. Fantastic. Nick scrolled through more formulas. When do we meet this paragon of Varian virtue? As if on cue, the lab door slid open. A tall skeletal Varian male, and his silver hair pulled back in severe braids that emphasized his sharp features and cold green eyes. Unlike the flowing robes most Varians preferred, he wore a high-collared formal suit that reminded Nick of historical pictures of Earth military dictators. Lady Zeva, he intoned, his gaze deliberately avoiding her altered figure. I see reports of your condition were not exaggerated. Instructor Zor. Elria acknowledged her posture automatically straightening into rigid formality. Despite her discomfort, the High Council honors me with your attention. Z Thor's attention shifted to Nick, his vertical pupils contracting to thin slits, and this is the human responsible. Nick extended his hand with deliberate casualness. Nick Ray's pleasure to meet you, Zor. I'd say great things about you, but Leah hasn't had time to share all your wonderful qualities, yet Zor ignored the outstretched hand. You will address me as cultural ATs. Zor, human, sure thing, cultural ATs, Zor. Human or wait, is human part of your name or mine? The syntax is a little confusing. Leah shot Nick a warning glance, which he pretended not to notice. He wasn't about to kowtow to this walking icicle. The High Council has instructed me to monitor this situation until a resolution is reached, Zor continued. Ignoring Nick's comment, you will continue your research while maintaining the appropriate public appearance required by Section 42. And what exactly does appropriate public appearance entail? Nick asked, crossing his arms. You will attend all diplomatic and social functions as Lady Z's formal consort. You will observe proper Varian etiquette at all times, and you will refrain from any behavior that might bring further embarrassment to the Zev Thara lineage. So basically act like I've got a steel rod up. We understand the requirements, Elria interrupted hastily. We will comply while seeking a resolution to the physical alteration. ZTH. Thor's thin lips pressed into an even thinner line. See that you do. The council has granted you 2 weeks to reverse the effects. After that time, more permanent measures will be considered. After Zor departed, Nick let out a long whistle. Charming guy. Was he born with that personality, or did he have to work at it? Zor believes in absolute adherence to tradition, Leah said, sinking into a chair, and he has never approved of my scientific career. Let me guess, he thinks noble ladies should stick to arranging flowers and planning dinner parties. Essentially, yes. Leah winced as she shifted position. These sensations are distracting. Nick's mind immediately conjured images he shouldn't be having about his research partner, but he couldn't den the spark of masculine satisfaction at seeing the normally composed Varian thrown off balance. There was something undeniably attractive about watching her prim exterior crack to reveal glimpses of genuine emotion. Focus rays, he chided himself, ogling your accidental alien fiancé isn't going to solve this problem, but another part of him, the part that had always appreciated beautiful women regardless of species, wasn't entirely sorry about their predicament. If he had to be culturally bound to someone, he could do a lot worse than the brilliant, gorgeous Varian scientist who'd been starring in his private thoughts since day one. Let's get to work on that antidote, he said, forcing his mind back to science, and maybe see about getting you some more accommodating clothes. In the meantime, over the next few days, Nick and Laria fell into a new routine in the lab. They worked frantically on developing an antidote, running simulation after simulation to find a compound that would reverse the effects without causing additional problems. After hours, they were forced to attend a series of diplomatic functions as Vera's most talked about engaged couple. The first such event was a diplomatic dinner hosted by the Earth ambassador. Nick arrived at Leah's quarters to escort her, as tradition apparently demanded, only to find her in visible distress. I cannot attend, she declared the moment her door slid open. Nick stepped inside, letting the door close behind him. What's wrong? This is wrong, she gestured to her formal attire, a silver blue gown that had clearly been altered in haste to accommodate her new proportions. The result was less than subtle drawing attention to precisely what she wanted to hide. I look beautiful, Nick finished honestly. Leah's head snapped up, her eyes widening. That is not the appropriate response. Maybe not the appropriate Varen response, Nick countered with a crooked Smile, but it's the honest human one. A flush spread across her cheeks, and she turned away. Your species' preoccupation with physical attributes is incomprehensible, says the woman whose people engineered themselves to be 7 feet tall with perfect violet skin and silver hair. Nick teased face at Elria. Varians are just as vain as humans. You're just more repressed about it. I am not repressed, she protested. I am disciplined. Nick stepped closer. Then why are you blushing right now? I am not. Elria touched her cheeks, feeling their warmth. This is simply a physiological reaction to the elixir. If you say so. Nick offered his arm. Come on. If we have to do this, let's at least have some fun with it. Fun is not the objective. It never is with you people. Nick sighed. One dinner, we smile, we nod, we make nice with the ambassador, and then we get back to work on the antidote deal. Reluctantly, Elria placed her hand on his. Them inside. Warning, containment breach detected. The automated system announced emergency lockdown initiated. What the hell? Nick hurried to the control panel. There's no breach. The system's been tampered with. Leah joined him at the console. The lockdown protocol has been manually overridden. We cannot disengage it from inside. Who would? Nick stopped. Z. Thor, that is a serious accusation, Lara said, but her tone lacked conviction. Come on, Laria, he's been looking for any excuse to sabotage us from the beginning. Perhaps. She frowned at the console. Regardless, we are sealed in for the standard quarantine period, 12 hours. Nick sighed. Well, at least we can keep working on the antidote. As the hours passed, they worked side by side, occasionally brushing against each other in the confined space. Each contact sent visible shivers through Leah. Her composure increasingly difficult to maintain. You should rest, Nick suggested, after she fumbled a sample for the 3rd time. You're exhausted. I am fine, she insisted. But her voice lacked its usual assurance. Leah. Nick placed his hands on her shoulders, turning her to face him. Talk to me. What's really going on? The direct contact and his intense gaze broke through her remaining defenses. I can't control it, she whispered. The emotions, the sensations there, overwhelming. The physical changes, not just that. She looked away. The elixir has affected my neural patterns. The emotional discipline I've maintained since childhood is deteriorating. Nick's brow furrowed. What kind of discipline? Varian nobility undergo neurological conditioning from an early age. We learn to suppress emotional responses, to prioritize duty and logic over person desires. Her hands trembled slightly. Without that conditioning, you're feeling things you weren't supposed to feel, Nick finished softly. She nodded, her eyes meeting his with startling directness. I have never experienced emotions with such intensity. It is frightening. Welcome to being human, Nick said with a gentle smile. We live in that intensity all the time. How do you function? How do you make rational decisions when your body betrays you at every turn? We don't always make rational decisions, Nick admitted, but sometimes the irrational ones turn out to be the most important. They lapsed into silence, the air between them charged with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Nick asked the question that had been bothering him. What was your childhood like growing up? As Varian nobility, Elria considered for a moment. Structured, demanding every moment. Scheduled, every action evaluated against the standards of our lineage. Sounds lonely. It was appropriate, she countered. But without conviction. What about fun, play, friends? Such things were considered distractions from our purpose. Leah's expression softened with memory. Though I did once create an unauthorized experiment, growing crystal formations in my sleep chamber. My mother discovered it and got mad. She was disappointed, Elria said, the word carrying surprising weight. I never experimented outside the laboratory. Again, that's why you became a scientist, Nick realized to have a legitimate Outlet for your curiosity, Leah looked surprised, as if she'd never considered this perhaps, and why did you choose cybernetics? When you grow up in the system, you learn to fix things yourself. Nobody else is going to do it for you, Nick shrugged. I was good with machines. Got a scholarship to MIT Luna, and never looked back. You overcame significant obstacles, Leah observed. Didn't have much choice, it was that or end up mining ice. On Europa with the other colony, Orphan's a loud alarm suddenly blared through the lab, cutting their conversation short. The central processing unit erupted in sparks, and smoke began filling the chamber system. Failure, the computer announced fire suppression. Offline, Nick lunged for the emergency extinguisher, but a secondary explosion knocked him backward. He hit the floor hard, his vision blurring from the impact. Through the smoke, he saw a ceiling panel break loose directly above him. Before he could move, Leah's form appeared above him, shielding his body with her own. As the panel crashed down, it struck her shoulder with a sickening crack, but she didn't flinch, her body remaining firmly positioned to protect him. When the smoke cleared and the emergency system finally engaged, Nick helped Leah to a sitting position, stunned by what she had done. You could have been seriously injured, he said, examining her shoulder. As could you, she replied simply. Why would you do that? Varian nobles don't risk themselves for commoners, especially not alien commoners. Leah met his gaze directly. Perhaps I am no longer functioning according to Varan noble parameters. The implications of her statement hung between them, interrupted only when the lab doors finally slid open to reveal Z Thor in a security team. What happened? ZTH Thor demanded, his eyes narrowing at their proximity equipment. Malfunction, Nick replied, deliberately omitting his suspicions. Convenient timing. Zor's expression remained impassive. The High Council convenes tomorrow to evaluate your progress. I suggest you prepare your report carefully. Human, the High Council chamber intimidated even Nick with its soaring crystal dome and 13 elevated seats arranged in a semicircle. Elria stood beside him, her posture rigid despite the lingering pain from her injured shoulder. Her physical changes remained obvious, despite the formal robes, specially designed to minimize them. Pallor occupied the second chair with Zor standing at his right hand, their matching expressions of disdain made their alliance clear. We have reviewed your progress reports, Thalor announced. They are insufficient. We've had some setbacks, Nick countered. But our latest formula shows promise in simulation. Simulations are not results, Zor interjected, and certain evidence has come to light that cast doubt on your intentions. Technician Rays, he activated a holographic display showing laboratory records that had been obviously altered to suggest Nick had deliberately targeted the elixir for Varian consumption. This is fabricated, Laria protested. The original formula was clearly labeled for human physiology, only yet you consumed it, Thalor noted. Perhaps because you were encouraged to do so. That's ridiculous, Nick snapped. Why would I want this to happen? To secure a cultural binding with a member of the High Council lineage, South Thor suggested smoothly, an ambitious move for a human of your limited standing. The Council murmured, clearly swayed by this interpretation. These accusations are baseless, Elria declared, her voice stronger than Nick had ever heard it. Technician Rays has worked tirelessly to reverse the effects. Your judgment is compromised, niece, Thalor said dismissively. The elixir has affected your emotional control, a fact evident to all present. As if to prove his point, Leah's cheeks flushed with anger. Her enhanced sensitivity to criticism obvious. The Council has reached its decision, Thalor continued. Technician Nicholas Rays will be removed from the exchange program and deported to Earth immediately. And Lady Nick demanded. Zor's thin lips curved in what might have been Satisfaction, Lady Z, will undergo the purification procedure to reverse both. The physical and neurological effects of the contamination purification, Nick, looked to Elria, whose face had gone pale. What is that, a complete neural reset? She whispered. It would remove all effect of the elixir, but also much of my recent memory and emotional development. It would make her a proper Varian noble. Once again, Salar said coldly. You can't do this, Nick protested. That procedure could cause permanent damage. The decision is made. Talbot declared security will escort technician. Raised to detention pending deportation. The purification procedure will be performed at dawn. As the guards moved to separate them, Nick caught Leah's eye for the first time since he'd known. Her emotions were written plainly on her face: fear, regret, and something deeper that made his chest tighten. This isn't over, he promised, as they pulled him away. The last thing he saw before the council chambers doors closed was Leah standing alone, her violet skin pale with dread, her altered body a visible reminder of how a simple accident had changed everything between them. Nick paced the narrow confines of his detention cell at 8 steps forward, 8 steps back. The sterile white space offered nothing to focus on except his mounting frustration and the countdown clock on the wall. 54,722. Until his scheduled deportation. Damn it, he muttered, slamming his fist against the wall. The thought of Elria facing that purification procedure made his blood boil. He'd seen the fear in her eyes. Whatever this procedure entailed, it wasn't just about revering physical changes. They were going to rewire her brain, strip away the emotional awakening she'd experienced. The very idea made him sick. Over the past weeks, he'd watched her transform from a cold, distant aristocrat into someone vibrant and alive. Yes, her enhanced figure had initially caught his attention. He was only human after all. But it was the woman emerging from behind that rigid Varian mask who had truly captivated him, and they're going to erase her like deleting a file. They don't. Like Nick had never been one for serious relationships. Life as an orphan had taught him to keep things casual, to avoid attachments that could be taken away. But Leah, she was different. The way she'd thrown herself between him and danger in the lab, the vulnerability in her eyes when she spoke of her childhood, the flush that spread across her violet skin whenever he touched her. Those weren't things he could just walk away from. The cell door chimed, interrupting his thoughts. Nick tensed, ready for another round with Zor or the guards. But when the door slid open, he found himself facing a young Varian female he'd never seen before. She was clearly related to Elria, the same elegant features in silver hair, though her violet skin was a shade lighter, and her green eyes lacked the golden tint of Leah's. Unlike most Varians he'd encountered, she wore her silver hair in a simple style, and her clothing was less formal, almost rebellious by Varian standards. You must be Nick Reyes, she said, glancing back over her shoulder before stepping inside, allowing the door to close behind her. And you are Kira, Zevthara, Leah's sister. She fixed him with an appraising look. I expected someone more imposing, given the way you've thrown our entire societal structure into chaos. Nick couldn't help but grin. Sorry to disappoint. The chaos-causing muscles are hidden under the uniform. To his surprise, Kira laughed, a sound he'd rarely heard from any Varian. I can see why my sister is risking everything for you. Risking everything? What do you mean? Kira's expression turned serious. Elria has refused the purification procedure. She did what she told the council. She would not submit to neural recalibration. Kira's eyes gleamed with a mixture of concern and admiration. She said she would rather be exiled than return to emotional suppression. Nick felt a surge of pride, quickly followed by alarm. What did the council do? They've confined her to our family estate. until they can resolve her temporary mental instability. Kira made air quotes with her long violet fingers. Uncle Tavor is trying to invoke the family override protocol, which would allow him to authorize the procedure without her consent. That's barbaric. Nick growled. That's very in tradition. Kira corrected bitterly. Why do you think I joined the cultural reform movement? There's a cultural reform movement, small but growing. Many younger variants question the emotional conditioning, the rigid hierarchy, the isolation. She pulled a small device from her pocket and placed it on the cell wall. It emitted a soft pulse, and the surveillance indicator in the corner of the cell dimmed. We don't have much time. The security dampener only works for a few minutes. Nick straightened. You're here to get me out. I'm here because my sister's neurological scans show something the council is desperately trying to conceal. Kira said urgently. The elixir didn't just enhance her physically, it temporarily neutralized the genetic modifications that suppress emotional responses in Varian nobility. Wait, genetic modifications? You're saying Varian nobles are genetically engineered to not feel emotions, not all emotions, just the intense ones: passion, desire, rage, deep joy. Kira's expression hardened. Our ancestors believed these feelings led to conflict and instability, so they engineered the ruling class to prioritize logic and duty above all else. That's messed up, Nick said flatly. Yes, but it's also the foundation of our social hierarchy. Kira checked a sleek wrist device. We have 3 minutes. Will you help save my sister from being emotionally lobotomized or not? Nick didn't hesitate. What's the plan? 30 minutes later, Nick and Kira crouched in the underbrush at the edge of the Zev Thea Estate's perimeter. The sprawling compound was surrounded by a shimmering energy field and patrolled by security drones. You sure this will work? Nick whispered, eyeing the security drones nervously. Kira held up a small control module. The family security grid recognizes my biometric signature. I can create a temporary opening, and once we're inside, Elria is being held in the East Wing. Our parents and the family elders are gathered in the main hall, likely trying to persuade her to accept the procedure voluntarily. She gave him a sidelong glance. You'll have approximately 20 minutes before Thaler arrives with the medical team. 20 minutes to find Elria. And where would we go? The entire planet is looking for us. The reform movement has a sanctuary in the northern mountains. If you can get Elria there, we can hide you until the council's next public session 3 days from now, and then can you present your findings about the elixir and the genetic modifications to the full council and the public. Kira's eyes burned with determination. Many variants suspect our emotional conditioning goes beyond discipline and training. Concrete proof could spark the reforms we've been working toward for years. Nick nodded, absorbing the enormity of what they were attempting. Let's do this. Kira activated her device, and a section of the energy barrier rippled and parted. They slipped through, hugging the shadows of the ornamental crystal trees that lined the approach to the massive estate. The main building resembled an ancient earth cathedral made of living crystal with soaring spires that seemed to capture and amplify the violet light of Vera's twin suns. They reached a side entrance where Kira pressed her palm to the scanner. The door slid open silently. The East Wing is through the grand gallery and up the celestial staircase. She whispered, I'll create a distraction in the main hall to keep the elders occupied. Nick squeezed her shoulder. Thank you for this. Just don't mess it up, human, she replied with a hint of a smile. My sister deserves someone who can keep up with her intellect, even if he is emotionally undisciplined. I'll take that as a compliment. Kira slipped away toward the main hall, while Nick made his way through the grand gallery, a cavernous space lined with holographic displays of Zara ancestors. looking suitably stern. And emotionless, he reached the celestial staircase, a gravity-defying spiral of crystalline steps that seemed to float upward without support, and began his ascent. At the top, he paused, listening. From somewhere to his right came the sound of voices, stern, insistent tones. Met with a familiar, defiant response that made his heart leap, Nick followed the sound to an ornate door slightly. Ajar through the gap, he could see Elria, standing by a window, her back straight, facing an older Varian female who could only be her mother despite the situation. Nick couldn't help but appreciate how the sunlight streaming through the window highlighted Leah's figure, her enhanced curves evident even beneath the formal robe she wore. Your defiance dishonors our lineage. The older woman was saying the procedure is for your own good, my own good. Leah's voice carried an emotion Nick had never heard from her before, genuine anger, or the good of the council's agenda. The elixir didn't damage me, mother, it freed me. These are not your true feelings, daughter, this is chemical interference. These are the feelings you and father had genetically suppressed. Leah's hands clenched at her sides. For the first time in my life, I experience emotions without filtering them through layers of conditioning. I feel joy, excitement, desire, disgraceful. Her mother interrupted. Listen to yourself. You sound like a common laborer. Perhaps the laborers have it right, Leah countered. Perhaps true connection requires emotional honesty, not the sanitized approximation we've been taught to accept. Nick had heard enough. He pushed the door open, stepping into the room. Couldn't have said it better. Myself, both women whirled, Leah's eyes widening in shock, while her mother's narrowed in outrage. Guards, the older woman called sharply. They're a little busy with Kira's distraction, Nick replied, moving further into the room. Nice place you've got here, very sterile, Nick. Leah breathed, her composure cracking. How did you, your sisters? Pretty cool for Aryan, he said, with a grin. Seems to think you're worth breaking a few rules, for I agree. Lady Z drew herself up to her full height, which put her a good foot taller than Nick. This is an outrage. An alien intruder in the family quarters. Actually, according to your ancient laws, I'm practically family, Nick interrupted, being culturally bound to your daughter, and all a temporary aberration that will be corrected at dawn. Lady Zara snapped. No, mother, it won't. Elria stepped forward, placing herself between Nick and her mother. I meant what I said. I refuse the procedure. I will not allow you to erase the person I've become, the person I was always meant to be before genetic manipulation stifled my true nature. A commotion from the hallway interrupted them. Kira appeared at the doorway, breathless. Thalor has arrived early with the medical team. We need to go now. LZ Thea moved to block their path. Leah, think of your position, your responsibilities. I am Elria replied, her voice steady. For the first time, I'm thinking about my responsibility to myself and to all the other Varians who have had their emotional birthrights stolen by this twisted tradition. She turned to Nick, and what he saw in her eyes unveiled emotion, raw and powerful, nearly took his breath away. I choose this, she said simply. I choose to feel without warning. She closed the distance between them and took his hand. The contact sent a visible shiver through her violet skin, flushing deep purple from her cheeks down her neck, disappearing beneath her robe. Nick could feel the tremor in her fingers, the intense intensity of her reaction to his touch, making his own pulse quicken. Lady Zevthara gasped in shock at this public display. Leah, control yourself. That's exactly what I'm choosing not to do anymore, mother. Leah's eyes never left Nick's face. Ready? Nick grinned. Lead the way. Gorgeous. They bolted past the stunned Lady Z, following Kira down a service corridor that led to a private landing pad where a small transport vessel waited. This will take you to the northern mountains, Kira explained as they boarded. The coordinates are pre-programmed. You're not coming, Elria Asked Kira, shook her head. Someone needs to stay behind to feed misinformation, too. Thalor, besides, her lips curved in a sly smile. You too. Probably need some privacy. To discuss strategy, Nick laughed as Leah's face flushed purple again. I like. Your sister, he told Elria as the transport door sealed. She has always been the rebellious one, Leah replied. Settling into the pilot's seat with practiced ease, I was the perfect Z daughter until you accidentally drank my special juice and grew a pair of yes, thank you, that's quite enough. Elria cut him off, her flush deepening. As she activated the transport's engines, that particular detail need not be repeated at every opportunity. Sorry, Nick said, not sounding sorry at all there. Just kind of hard to ignore, especially when you're all flustered and glowy. Elria glanced down at her chest where her enhanced curves strained against her formal robe. These physical alterations are the least significant change the elixir has caused, she said quietly. I know. Nick's tone softened the emotion. Stuff, that's what's really freaking them out, isn't it? She nodded, guiding the transport away from the estate and toward the distant mountains. Emotional control is the foundation of our social order. If nobles began experiencing full odal capacity, they might realize how messed up the whole system is. Nick finished. Precisely, they flew in companionable silence for a while, the transport skimming over Vera's violet forest toward the jagged peaks on the horizon. So Nick finally asked, no regrets about refusing the procedure. Leah considered the question seriously. The physical changes are inconvenient, though not entirely unpleasant, but the Amat awakening. She shook her head. I could no more return to emotional suppression than you could choose to stop breathing. I've got to say I like this version of you, Nick admitted. Not that the Ice Queen scientist wasn't hot too, in her own intimidating way. You found me attractive even before the physical enhancement. Elria sounded genuinely surprised. Are you kidding? Tall, brilliant, gorgeous alien woman who could calculate molecular bonds in her head and looked at me like I was simultaneously the most fascinating and annoying creature in the galaxy. Nick grinned, total turn on Leah's lips curved in a smile more uninhibited than any he'd seen from her before. You are a very strange human, Nick. Reese, part of my charm, the reform movement sanctuary turned out to be a complex of caves transformed into surprisingly comfortable living quarters, nestled high in the northern mountains. For 3 days, Nick and Laria worked with the movement's scientists, analyzing the data from Leah's neural scans and comparing it to historical records that the reformers had secretly compiled. Nick was amazed to discover the extent of the reform movement. Hundreds of younger variants who questioned the rigid traditions and emotional suppression of their society. Many were low-ranking nobles who had received less extensive genetic modification than the high-ranking families, allowing them to experience glimpses of what full emotional capacity might feel like. On the morning of the council's public session, Leah found Nick on an observation platform watching the twin suns rise over the violet forest far below. Beautiful view, he commented as she joined him. Indeed, but she wasn't looking at the landscape. Her eyes were fixed on his profile, a new boldness in her gaze that made his skin warm. Ready for today, he asked, turning to face her. As ready as possible. She wore a formal robe provided by the reform movement, modified to accommodate her enhanced figure without emphasizing it. The evidence is compelling, but the council is deeply invested in maintaining the status quo. Then we'll just have to be more compelling, Nick said confidently. Leah hesitated, then stepped closer to him. Nick, regardless of what happens today, I want you to know that I do not regret drinking the elixir. Her voice lowered. These past weeks have been the most meaningful of my life, even the embarrassing parts, the blushing, the starring the whispers, even those she admitted they were worth it for the other experiences. Nick raised an eyebrow. What other experiences? Instead of answering, Lyria closed the distance between them and pressed her lips to his. The effect was electric, her violet skin flushed. Immediately, a wave of deep purple spreading visibly down her neck and across what he could see of her chest. She trembled against him, clearly overwhelmed by the sensations, but she didn't pull away when they finally separated. Her breath came in quick gasps. That was most illuminating. Nick laughed, his arm still around her waist. That's one way to put it. I'd go with mind-blowing myself. We should proceed to the transport, she said, making no move to step away from him. The council session begins in 2 hours. Right. Nick reluctantly released her. Let's go overthrow your society's oppressive of emotional regime. The Grand Council chamber was packed to capacity with dignitaries, scientists, and citizens. Filling every available space word had spread of Leah's defiance in the upcoming challenge to the council's authority, drawing unprecedented public interest. Nick and Leah stood before the semicircle of council members, facing Thor's cold fury and Zor's calculating stare behind them. Members of the reform movement had strategic ally positioned themselves throughout the chamber, ready to show support. Lady Zev Thara, the council leader, an ancient Varian named VTH, addressed Elria. You stand accused of violating the sacred traditions of our people and bringing dishonor to your lineage through public emotional displays. How do you respond? Leah's voice rang clear through the chamber. I stand before you not as an accused, but as a revelation. The elixir I consumed did not damage me. It freed me from genetic manipulation that I never consented to. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Nonsense. Thalor interjected. The emotional discipline of nobility is achieved through training and meditation. Lies. Nick stepped forward, activating a holographic display that showed Leah's neural scans alongside historical medical records. Your so-called discipline is genetically engineered suppression, targeting specific brain regions responsible for emotional processing. The murmur grew louder. The evidence is clear. Leah continued. For generations, the high noble families have been subjected to genetic modification without their knowledge or consent, creating an artificial hierarchy based not on merit, but on emotional dampening. This is treasonous fabrication, Zor declared, but his voice lacked conviction. As the evidence hovered in the air for all to see, is it? Nick challenged then. Explain why Lady Zev Thea's neural patterns after exposure to the elixir match those of historical Varians from before the great emotional discipline supposedly began. The council chambers erupted in chaos as people began discussing the implications. VTH banged his ceremonial staff for order. Even if what you say has merit, he finally said, these measures were implemented for the stability of our society. Unfettered emotions led to the great conflict that nearly destroyed our civilization. With respect, Elder, a new voice called out. Kira stepped forward from the crowd. That history has been distorted. The ancient records show that it was not emotion itself that caused the conflict, but the imbalance between those who could feel and those who were denied that right. Other reformers stood, adding their voices in support. We are not advocating for chaos, Leah said firmly. We are advocating for choice. Let each Varian decide whether to undergo emotional conditioning rather than imposing it from birth. Impossible. Thalor scoffed. The foundation of our society is built on a lie. Nick finished. And now that lie has been exposed, you can adapt, or you can watch your perfect society fracture from within as more and more Varians discover the truth. The council members conferred among themselves, their expressions grave. Finally, VTH addressed the chamber. These revelations require careful consideration. The council will recess to deliberate hours later. The council reconvened VCs. Expression was solemn as he delivered their decision. After reviewing the evidence, the council acknowledges that certain historical measures were implemented without full disclosure to our people. He paused, clearly struggling with the admission. In the interest of preventing societal discord, we propose the following compromise. The terms were better than Nick had shed hope. The practice of genetic emotional suppression would be made optional for future generations. A new human variant cultural exchange initiative would be established to explore the benefits of emotional integration, with Nick and Lara appointed as joint directors, and most surprisingly, the council agreed to create a reform advisory committee with Kira as its head. Additionally, VTH concluded, we acknowledge that Lady Leah Zara's condition resulted from an accident rather than deliberate action by technician. Raise therefore, while the cultural binding may be dissolved if both parties wish. We don't wish. Nick interrupted, taking Leah's hand without hesitation. She flushed immediately, but her fingers twined firmly with his. Very well, VTH said, looking somewhat bemused, then let it be recorded that the binding stands by mutual consent. As the chamber emptied, Zor approached them, his expression unreadable. You have altered the course of Varian society, he said stiffly. Time will tell, if for better or worse. Time will tell, Leah agreed. But for the first time, we will face that future honestly with our full selves, not just the parts deemed acceptable by tradition. Zor departed without further comment, but Thalor lingered, studying them with narrowed eyes. This is not over, niece, he warned quietly. Some traditions do not die easily, neither does the desire for freedom, uncle, she replied calmly. You would understand that if you allowed yourself to feel it. 1 month later, Nick and Leah stood on the balcony of the newly established Cultural Exchange Center, watching the sunset paint Vera's crystalline spires in shades of deep purple and gold. The first group of human scientists would arrive the following day, and a contingent of young Varians, including some who had chosen to undergo the reversal of their emotional conditioning, were preparing for exchange visits to Earth. Quite a view, Nick said, slipping his arm around Leah's waist. Indeed, she leaned into him, no longer startled by her body's response to his touch, though the flush still spread across her violet skin, a reaction that Nick suspected would never completely fade. Any regrets, he asked, genuinely curious about the elixir, the changes any of it. Leah turned to face him, her golden green eyes holding his gaze steadily. I never thought I'd say this, she replied with a smile, but thank you for enlarging my perspective on life. Nick burst out laughing. Did you just make a boob joke? I've corrupted you completely, perhaps, she admitted, her flush deepening, or perhaps you simply helped me discover who I already was beneath the suppression. I like who you are, he said, honestly. Enhanced assets, and all in response, Elria did something unprecedented in Varian history. She initiated a public kiss with her human partner, right there on the balcony in full view of the plaza below. As their lips met, her heightened sensitivity triggered something new, a soft bioluminescent glow that spread across her violet skin, lighting her from within like the aurora that sometimes danced above Vera's poles. The gathered crowd below fell silent, then erupted in cheer, led by the unmistakable voice of Kira. Zatara. When they parted, Nick grinned at Leah's luminous blush. Did you just literally light up because I kissed you? A previously undocumented side effect, she murmured, unsuccessfully fighting her embarrassment. I think it's awesome, Nick declared. My very own glow-in-the-dark alien girlfriend. The correct term is cultural bond partner, she corrected primly, though her eyes sparkled with humor. Nope, Definitely girlfriend Nick. Insisted pulling her close again, or maybe fiancé. Will work up to wife presumptuous human. Bioluminescent alien, as the twin suns of Vera Prime dip below the horizon casting. Their final rays across the city Nick, and Leah remained on the balcony silhouetted against the darkening sky A. Human and Avarian, bound together by an accidental elixir that had changed not. Just a body but an entire world, and if Leah's enhanced curves pressed a little. More firmly against Nick's chest, as they embraced again, well, some accidents it seemed were worth keeping.